you're a gamer and you're looking for the very best gaming performance, you have a choice of going with AMD or Intel. Now that both companies have had their respective flagships out for a short amount of time. Now, this is a test that I've wanted to do for a while because they're both kind of top dog when it comes to gaming, but because of very different reasons. One goes down the route of having performance cores and efficiency cores and focusing on sheer unadulterated speed with a max turbo frequency of 5.2 GHz, while the other does things slightly differently and instead puts its focus heavily on the 3D cache design, which does limit other areas like overclocking. Though today we're looking at both of them in their straight out of the box performance in 20 games. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits from my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32GB of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. You call me the stupid one. Now, when it comes to testing hardware of this nature, we have a lot of key decisions that we need to make, especially given that the 12900K and Z690 platform has support for the fastest DDR5 memory, compared to the 5800X3D on the almost phased out AM4 platform. I say that because we all know that AM5 is kind of around the corner, which will also have support for DDR5. Now with this test, we could have gone DDR5 on the Intel and fast DDR4 on the AMD. And while this would, I guess, represent what the average consumer is likely to go and buy, DDR5 is still at a premium, especially for those faster speed kits that really make a difference when compared to DDR4. That's why we decided to keep things as fair as possible and test both processors on the same memory kit. That kit, of course, is our usual Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB 32GB 3600MHz dual channel kit. In light of trying to keep things as fair as possible, we even tried to match up the motherboards as close as we could. And for the Intel system, we used the MSI Mag Z690 Tomahawk Wi-Fi DDR4. And for the AMD system, we used the MSI MPG X570S Edge Max Wi-Fi, which are both at least in the same realm when it comes to pricing. In terms of the GPU, we wanted to use a card that was pretty typical of what someone would buy if looking at either of these CPUs, and while a 3090 or 3090 Ti is the top tier GPU of choice, the RTX 3080 seemed like the more sensible option for this test, and being pretty indicative of what the average consumer would actually go for. One thing to note is the price difference between each CPU, with the 5800X3D coming in at £439 in the UK or $448 in the US, while the 12900K comes in more expensive at £570 or $609 in the US. Obviously with Intel you do have the option of saving a little bit of money if you don't need the iGPU and going for the 12900KF, but I wanted to make you aware of pricing as we go through the benchmarks. It's also worth noting that resizable bar wasn't enabled for this test, but maybe something we look at again in the future, so let us know if you'd like to see that in a future video. But for now, let's get on with our first test. First up, we have Assassin's Creed Valhalla at 1080p. Here we straight away see the 12900K with a higher average FPS over the 5800X3D by around 2.9%. While this is off to a good start, it is worth noting that the 5800X3D is the cheaper of the two processors and is still keeping up. At 1440p, the two CPUs come in with very similar results at around 90 FPS. Again, based on pricing, it's not looking like the 12900K is worth the extra money, at least at this resolution. As we move up to 4K, in a weird turn of events, the 5800X3D actually ends up overtaking the 12900K, albeit only by 2 FPS. But given its more aggressive price point, it definitely shows that AMD has the better value for money product. Moving on to the next game, and in Call of Duty Warzone at 1080p, we see both CPUs again with very similar results. The one thing worth noting here, however, is that the 1% low on the AMD processor is significantly lower than what we see from Intel. At 1440p, there is more of a noticeable difference between the results, with the 5800X3D sitting ahead by a small margin, though that 1% low figure is still lower than that of the 12900K. Then as we move up to 4K, we start to see the 5800X3D push ahead even more, with the 1% low falling more in line with where we'd expect it to be. I guess that 3D cache simply prefers higher resolution gameplay. So a title that you've wanted us to include for quite some time, and Cyberpunk 2077. At 1080p, the 12900K stormed ahead by a whopping 30 frames per second. Now, it's not likely that you'll be playing at 1080p on a 3080 at these settings, but it's still something interesting to look at, especially given how close the other titles have been so far. At 1440p, the two CPUs draw closer together, with both sitting around 70 FPS average, though again the 1% low is much higher on the 12900K, meaning that we have a much more consistent and smoother gameplay experience with less dips overall. As we move up to 4K, we again see very similar results, though the Intel flagship still sits ahead by around 5% when looking at the 1% lows. Though at 37 FPS overall, some would argue that it's simply unplayable. But as someone who played and streamed Cyberpunk when it first came out at a locked 30 FPS, I've got to say it's perfectly fine. As we move on to Dirt 5 and at 1080p, we again see both CPUs performing practically the same, and likely due to the game being limited by performance. As we move up to 1440p, that theory essentially goes out the window, with very similar results again from both processors. The 12900K does sit ahead by just under 1%, but that could actually be argued as margin of error. At 4K again, we see the 5800X3D overtake the 12900K, although only with a less than 2% lead. Again, looking at the price disparity between the chips, I'd say that AMD comes out on top here. Moving on to Dying Light 2 at 1080p, again the results are very similar, with a slight edge towards the 12900K, though only by 1.3%. As we move up to 1440p, the results fall much more in line, with both processors sitting at 93 frames per second, though Intel fell slightly behind when looking at the 1% lows. At 4K, both CPUs served up practically identical performance in both the average FPS and 1% lows, and was likely limited more by the GPU than anything else. In FarCry 6, we start to see a bit more disparity between the two CPUs, with the 12900K sitting ahead with a 12 FPS lead. 1440p, the results shift around a little bit, with the 5800X3D now taking the lead by a small margin of 2 frames per second. And at 4K, the 5800X3D keeps that 2 FPS lead over the 12900K, showing that it's much better value for money, especially in this game. Looking at Gears 5 at 1080p, and again we see the 12900K coming out on top with another 12 FPS lead. Though at well over 150 FPS on both processors, there's nothing really to grumble at either way. At 1440p, the 12900K keeps that lead by around 6 FPS, and at 4K, the 12900K manages to keep that lead, albeit by a measly 2 FPS, but a win is still a win. Moving on to GTA 5, of which we know the CPU plays a big part, and interestingly at 1080p, we see the 5800X3D in the lead by 2 FPS. As we move up to 1440p, the 5800X3D loses its first place and instead comes in nigh on identical with the 12900K, with both processors giving us an average of around 187 FPS. As we move up to 4K, again we see identical performance at 165 FPS, likely again being restricted by the GPU and not the processors. In Halo Infinite, the 5800X3D takes the lead with a sizable difference of 12 FPS, though interestingly enough, we see the 1% low suffer in comparison to the 12900K. At 1440p, the CPUs both come in identically at 157 FPS, and at 4K we see the 5800X3D edge slightly ahead of the 12900K by 3 frames per second. Again, thinking about the value for money prospect, the AMD processor definitely seems to be the better buy overall. Looking at Horizon Zero Dawn, which is typically a title geared for AMD, and straight away we see the 5800X3D taking the lead by just over 5%. Though at over 180 FPS on both of the CPUs, I think it's fair to say that either will be fine at 1080p. At 1440p, we do see the 5800X3D fall slightly behind, with the 12900K overtaking it by a small margin. and then at 4K both processors fall more in line with the same 87 FPS. In Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition at 1080p, we saw very similar results, though the 5800X3D did manage to push ahead ever so slightly, with both processors well above 140 FPS. An interesting thing here is that the 1% low of the 5800X3D is much higher in this title in comparison to the 12900K. At 1440p, nothing really changes. Both CPUs are sitting just above 90 frames per second, with the 5800X3D still in the lead by around 4 FPS. As we move up to 4K, we see a slight variation in favour of the 12900K, but with less than 1 FPS between them, and quite a dramatic difference when looking at the 1% lows. Finally, looking at Rainbow Six Siege, and at 1080p both CPUs are sitting well ahead of over 460 FPS, with the 12900K getting ever closer to 500 frames per second, with a lead of around 28 FPS. At 1440p the roles switch, with the 5800X3D taking the lead over the 12900K with an 18 FPS difference. While at 4K the 12900K fights back, with both CPUs performing practically the same, with a small 2 FPS lead in favour of AMD. So a real mixed bag of results, with Intel ahead in some and AMD ahead in others, whereas some of the tests actually showed identical performance overall. Now, one of the key things for me was that when a processor shifted ahead by quite some margin, it seemed to show itself in the 1% lows, meaning that the small dips in performance were bringing down the average quite dramatically, and it's one of the reasons why we've now started to include 1% low data in our benchmark charts. Now, as the title suggests, we did actually test 20 games, as well as 2 synthetic benchmarks as part of the 3D Mark suite, and all of those extra charts that weren't shown here will be made available to our Patreon supporters, so if you want to be part of that and see some more testing data, you can by following the link down below. What is worth looking at though is total game averages at each resolution, where we've put everything we've tested together and worked out the average FPS across all titles tested to give a clear comparison set of data between the two processors. Now, when looking at 1080p, 1440p and 4K, the results were actually very surprising. Now, based on how Intel were ahead in some titles and AMD were ahead in others, we actually ended up seeing total performance across all 20 titles coming out practically the same. At 1080p, the results were the same, with a small variance on the 1% low in favour of the 12900K. While at 1440p, the results on the 1% low flipped ever so slightly in favour of the 5800X3D, though with the average again, the same. Then at 4K, the 5800X3D pushed ahead slightly when looking at the 1% low, but shows that the average overall FPS is again nigh on identical. Now, obviously I said at the start that there's quite a big disparity when it comes to pricing, and while Intel do have the 12900KF as a bit of a kind of saving grace, even that still comes in more expensive than what AMD have to offer. Though it's still worth looking at a cost per frame when comparing both of these CPUs. And straight away we can see at 1080p, based on our testing data, AMD clearly do have the upper hand at around £2.15 per frame, compared to Intel at £2.78, which is a 29% increase. At 1440p, it's very much the same story, with around a 30% price increase for the 12900K over the 5800X3D, when looking at the cost per frame within the UK. And then at 4K it's the same again, with the 12900K coming in at £5.23 per frame compared to £4.02 for the 5800X3D. Moving over to the other side of the pond, and while the figures are slightly different, obviously the trend is the same, with the 5800X3D clearly showing the better value for money. At 1080p, the Intel chip comes in 35% more expensive per frame, while at 1440p that grew slightly to around 36%, and that was the same story at 4K too. Okay, so the figures kind of speak for themselves and it all seems pretty clear cut, but is it? I mean, there's definitely different ways you can look at what we've tested, and it's not a kind of clear victory to AMD, because while today we were looking at gaming performance, you have to remember that the 5800X3D lacks in other certain areas, namely when it comes to overclocking to eke extra performance, which could actually see Intel pull ahead, but even then it's not likely going to be by a huge amount. Now, the other area where we know Intel wins is in productivity related tasks, and something like a 5900X or 5950X would be a better chip to compare to if that's what you're looking for, especially as while we focused on gaming performance today, more and more gamers are looking at streaming or content creation as well. So obviously that has to be taken into account. What I'm trying to say is most gamers aren't just using their PC for gaming, though it is the biggest part of their PC build and kind of the main reason why we made this video today. Now, one key thing that could see a large difference and something that I guess gives the 12900K a small victory is the fact that it's more future-proof ready than what AMD have here in terms of the platform. We know that AM4 will be retired soon, whereas the Intel platform has at least one more generation in it. And the fact that we could retest it using faster DDR5, we could see some big gains there as well. Let me know in the comments section if that's maybe something you want to see in a future video. Yes, it comes down at, I guess, a higher total cost when comparing to the 5800X3D with DDR4, but maybe the gains will be worth the extra cost there. Maybe something for a future video. What do you guys think? Firstly, is the victory to AMD as clear-cut as the chart's made out, or is it worth delving into a bit more? Obviously we have, as I mentioned, DDR5, and we also have other SKUs from Intel like the 12900KF or even the 12700K or KF SKU. Either way, it's nice to have choice in the market and to see what's available from both sides, and it'd be an interesting thing to see, when AM5 comes out and what that actually brings to the table. So there we have it. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And again, let me know in the comments section as to what you want to see next. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to check out data for all of the games that we tested, you can do so over on Patreon, where you'll get access to a ton of other goodies as well, including a super special secret area on our Discord, behind the scenes content, our exclusive bi-weekly game nights, and much, much more. The link is down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.